He ran on hands and feet, foam in his throat, ribs pressing through skin. When the rifle cracked, he didn't flinch, but she did. The sound was a shard of glass in the evening's throat. Lorette Key lowered the old Winchester from her shoulder, the polished wood warm against the cool, dead skin of her cheek. Down in the sorghum field, the pack of men and dogs stuttered to a halt. They were dark shapes against the bruised purple of the twilight, their shouts thin and ragged in the vast empty air. The boy, a frantic, four-limbed creature, kept scrambling, a blur of bone and dirt moving toward the flimsy sanctuary of her homestead. Lorette's house was a box of silence. For 2 years, since the fever had taken Samuel and then Jonas a week later, the only sounds had been the wind in the eaves and the creak of floorboards under her solitary weight. The silence was a physical thing, a heavy blanket she wore day and night. The rifle's report had torn it, and the tearing hurt more than the quiet ever had. She watched the boy. He was not running like a boy. He moved with the desperate, earth-hugging panic of a rabbit caught in the open. The dogs, lean and black, strained at their leashes, their barks a percussive, hateful sound that scraped at Lorette's teeth. The men were shouting again, their voices carrying threats she didn't need to decipher. They were the voices of men who believed the world and everything in it was theirs for the taking, the breaking, the killing. She'd heard those voices in the market town, bartering for grain. She'd heard a softer version of it in her own husband's throat, years ago, when he'd talked about the land and the people who wandered it without fences. The boy reached the edge of her tilled garden, his breath a raw, tearing noise she could hear even from the porch. He stumbled, fell, and rose again, his face a mask of mud and terror. His eyes, wide and black, were fixed on the dark rectangle of her open doorway, not on her. On the darkness, the hole, the promise of an escape from the light. One of the men raised his own rifle, a puff of smoke, and the dirt near the boy's flailing feet jumped. It wasn't a killing shot. It was a game, a herding tactic. They were playing with him, the way a cat plays with a mouse before the snap of the spine. A cold, hard knot formed in Lorette's stomach. It was a feeling she hadn't felt since she'd stood over Jonas's small, still body and realized the world would just keep turning. The sun would keep rising, and no one would stop to mark the injustice of it. Her grief was not a soft, weeping thing. It was a shard of granite in her gut. She raised the Winchester again, sighting not on the men, but on the lone, skeletal oak that stood between them and her property line. She didn't think. Thought had abandoned her 2 years ago, leaving only routine and silence behind. She acted. The butt of the rifle kicked hard into the hollow of her shoulder, a familiar, bruising comfort. The crack was louder this time, a definitive statement. A piece of bark exploded from the oak's trunk. This time the men understood. The shouts stopped. The dogs whined, confused. In the sudden quiet, the boy's rasping breath was the only sound in the world. He scrambled the last few yards, his torn trousers catching on the splintered edge of the bottom porch step. He fell, a heap of sharp angles and exhaustion, his face pressed against the dusty, weathered boards, not 3 feet from where Lorette stood. He lay there, shuddering, his back a latticework of fresh, dark welts, bleeding sluggishly into the dust. The men stood for a long moment, their silhouettes stark against the dying light. Lorette did not move. She kept the rifle held loosely at her side, the barrel pointing toward the ground but ready. She was a statue carved from grief, her face a blank mask. Let them look. Let them see the woman who had nothing left to lose, and so had become, in her own way, a part of the unyielding landscape. One of the men, the leader by his stance, spat on the ground. Then, with a sharp whistle, he turned, pulling his dogs with him. The others followed, melting back into the sorghum fields, their grumbled curses swallowed by the rising tide of crickets. The silence that returned was different. It was not the empty, stagnant silence of her grief. It was charged, humming with the boy's ragged breathing and the phantom echo of the rifle shots. Lorette looked down. The boy hadn't moved. His knuckles were raw, his hair matted with sweat and something dark and sticky. A low, guttural moan escaped his throat, a sound stripped of all language, all humanity. It was the sound of an animal caught in a trap, the leg broken, the will to fight bleeding out onto the cold earth. She felt nothing. Not pity, not compassion. Just the hard, unyielding knot of defiance in her belly. The world had tried to kill this thing, this child. It had hunted him for sport, whipped him like a cur. And for no reason she could name, she had decided it would not happen on her land. Not tonight. Slowly, methodically, she ejected the spent shell casing. It tinkled onto the porch boards, a small, bright, metallic sound in the vast, encroaching darkness. She nudged the boy's shoulder with the toe of her boot. He flinched violently, curling into a tighter ball, a whimper catching in his throat. His eyes, when he finally turned them toward her, were black pits. There was no plea in them, no hope, no recognition of her as a savior. There was only the stark, bottomless terror of a creature that had never known anything else. They were not the eyes of a child. They were the eyes of the world she had come to know, merciless, broken, and utterly, terrifyingly wild. She did not offer a hand. She did not speak a word of comfort. She simply stood back, holding the rifle, and jerked her head toward the open, dark doorway of her silent house. An invitation not to comfort, but to a deeper, more dangerous quiet. He dragged himself over the threshold on his belly, like a snake, leaving a smear of blood and filth on the wood. Inside, he collapsed onto the rough-spun rug, and the house, for the first time in 2 years, held the sound of another's breath. A breath that was a ragged, painful testament to the world's casual brutality. Lorette closed the door, shutting out the night, and the lock sliding home was a sound as final as a spade striking soil. She did not take him to the spare room, the one that had been Jonas's. She couldn't. The ghosts in there were hers alone. She dragged him, his body surprisingly light, all bone and sinew, to the pantry, a small, windowless room off the kitchen with a thick wooden door and a sturdy bolt on the outside. It was where she kept sacks of flour and potatoes, dried herbs and preserves. It was cool and dark and smelled of earth and dried lavender. He fought her then, a weak, frantic thrashing. A low growl rumbled in his chest, and his teeth, surprisingly white in his mud-caked face, snapped at her hand. She felt a flicker of something, not fear, but a cold, clinical assessment, like checking a rabid animal for the froth. She was stronger. She maneuvered him inside, his bony shoulders scraping against the doorframe. Before he could scramble back out, she shut the door and slid the heavy iron bolt into place. Silence. Then, a frantic scratching at the wood. A series of dull, rhythmic thuds as he threw his small body against the door. Lorette stood in the kitchen, listening. The sounds were animal. The desperation was familiar. It echoed the frantic, silent screaming she had done inside her own head as she'd watched the light fade from Samuel's eyes. She lit a single lamp, the yellow glow pushing back the shadows but making the silence feel deeper. In the pantry, the thudding stopped. A low, keening sound took its place, the sound of a creature that has exhausted its rage and found only despair at the bottom. Lorette moved with the economy of long practice. She stoked the fire in the hearth, filled a basin with water from the pump, and set it to warm. She found a clean rag, one of Emmett's old undershirts, torn into strips. She found the tin of salve she used for the cow's chapped udders, a pungent, greasy mixture of lanolin and comfrey. When the water was warm, she unbolted the pantry door. He had wedged himself into the far corner, between a sack of winter wheat and the stone wall. His eyes gleamed in the lamplight, twin points of feral distrust. He hissed as she approached, a dry reptilian sound. "I'm not going to hurt you." she said. The words felt foreign in her mouth, rusty from disuse. He didn't understand them anyway. They were just sounds, and her sound was no different from the hunter's shouts. She set the basin down and dipped the rag. She advanced slowly, one step at a time. He pressed himself harder into the corner, making himself small, a tremor running through his emaciated frame. His back was a horror. The welts from the whip had broken open, crisscrossing in a grotesque pattern of torn flesh and drying blood. Flies, drawn by the scent, had followed him into the house and buzzed greedily around him. She expected him to fight, to bite, to claw. He didn't. As the warm, wet cloth touched his skin, he went rigid, a sharp intake of breath, but he did not move. He endured it. His stillness was more unnerving than any struggle. It was the stillness of a thing that has learned that fighting only brings more pain. Lorette worked methodically, her touch firm but not unkind. She was not a mother tending a child. She was a farmer tending wounded livestock. She cleaned the dirt from the wounds, her stomach turning at the depth of some of the cuts. The skin was split to the muscle, the edges raw and swollen. Under the grime, his skin was pale, stretched taut over a rack of ribs that stood out like ridges in a sand dune. She saw old scars, too, pale, silvery lines of healed-over burns on his arms, a puckered circle on his shoulder that looked like a brand. Someone had been hurting this boy for a very long time. When the wounds were clean, she took a dollop of the thick green salve on her fingers and began to work it into his broken skin. He flinched at the cool sting, a shudder racking his body, but he remained silent, his face pressed against the rough burlap of the wheat sack. The smell of the salve, pungent and medicinal, filled the small room, covering the stench of blood and fear. She left him a bowl of thin broth, mostly water with a hint of salt and chicken fat, and a dipper of fresh water. She didn't know if he would touch it. She bolted the door again and went back to the kitchen. The house felt different now, violated, not by the boy, but by the presence of his pain. His suffering was a loud, screaming thing in the quiet rooms. She sat at the kitchen table, the rifle across her lap, and stared at the pantry door. The silence from within was absolute. She thought of Samuel, his feverish tossing, his weak cries for water. She thought of Jonas, who had been quieter, slipping away with a sigh, as if simply too tired to keep breathing. She had cleaned their bodies, too. Her hands remembered the feel of their small, cooling limbs. The memory didn't bring tears. It hadn't for a year. It brought only a cold, hollowing emptiness. She had done this for the boy not out of kindness, not out of pity. Hope was a fool's game, and she was no fool. She had done it because his pain was an affront. The men who had hunted him, the world that had allowed it, they had trespassed. They had brought their casual cruelty onto her land, into the fortress of her grief. And her act of cleaning his wounds was not an act of healing. It was an act of erasure. She was washing their stain from her property. The boy was just the vessel for it. Hours passed. The lamp burned low. She must have dozed, because a sound from the pantry startled her awake. A soft scraping. The sound of the bowl being dragged across the floor. Then a desperate, slurping noise. He was drinking the broth. Lorette closed her eyes. The knot in her stomach eased, just a fraction. It was not relief. It was the grim satisfaction of a farmer who has gotten a half-dead calf to take milk. The animal might yet live, and if it lived, it was hers. Not the world's to torment, hers to keep, or to break. For 3 days, this was the rhythm. Lorette would unbolt the door in the morning, her hand resting on the small pistol she now kept tucked in her waistband. He would be huddled in the corner, wary, his eyes tracking her every move. She would clean his back. The wounds began to close, the angry red softening to a bruised purple. The swelling went down. She brought him food, more broth than a gruel of oats and water. He ate it ravenously, his eyes darting around as if expecting it to be snatched away. He never spoke. He made no sound at all, save for his breathing and the sounds of his eating. He smelled of fear and salve. The pantry was his cage, his den. He never tried the door. He seemed to understand its finality. On the fourth day, the fever came. She'd known it would. The wounds were too deep, too dirty. She heard him shivering through the thick wood of the door, a faint, chattering sound. When she opened it, a wave of heat rolled out. He was lying on his side, his limbs twitching, a low moan escaping his chapped lips. His eyes were glassy, unfocused. "Damn it," Laurette whispered to the empty kitchen. It was the first thing she'd said aloud in days. The fever. The fever was the enemy she knew. The fever was the thing that had stolen her sons. It had come for this one, too. For an instant, she considered leaving him, bolting the door and letting the fever run its course. It would be a mercy, perhaps, an end to his tormented existence. It would restore her silence. But the men's faces flashed in her mind, the sneer on the leader's lips, the casual cruelty in their sport. Letting the boy die now felt like letting them win. It felt like surrender. And Laurette Key did not surrender. She had been beaten, hollowed out, left for dead by grief, but she had not surrendered. She dragged him out of the pantry. He was limp now, his feral strength gone. She carried him, his head lolling against her shoulder, into the main room and laid him on the rug before the cold hearth. He was lighter than Samuel had been at the end. The thought was a physical blow. She worked for 2 days, a blur of grim, sleepless motion. She stripped him of his rags and washed his filthy body, every rib and vertebra a stark ridge under her hands. She forced willow bark tea between his clenched teeth, the bitter liquid dribbling down his chin. She bathed his forehead with cool cloths, turning them over and over, as if the simple motion could rewind time, could change the outcome. She was not Laurette, the grieving widow. She was a machine built for this single purpose. The house was no longer a tomb. It was a sick room. The silence was not empty. It was filled with the boy's shallow, rapid breathing and her own hushed, useless curses. In the depths of the second night, he began to thrash. His eyes flew open, but they saw nothing in the room. He cried out, not in his own language, but not in hers either. It was a string of terrified, sharp-edged syllables. He was seeing the hunters, the whip, the dogs. He screamed, a raw, piercing sound that clawed at the walls of the silent house. Laurette grabbed his flailing arms, her own strength failing. "Hush now," she grunted, pinning him down with her own body. "Hush." He fought her, his fever-fired strength immense. He was trying to run, even lying on his back. His head thrashed from side to side. "There's no one here," she said, the words a lie, because the room was full of ghosts. Her ghosts, and now his. His eyes, for a single lucid second, focused on her face. The terror in them was absolute. And then he said a word, a name. "Silas." The name hung in the air, cold and sharp. Silas. So the beast had a name. The fever broke near dawn on the third day. Laurette, slumped in a chair beside him, woke to a change in his breathing. It was deeper, slower. His skin, which had been burning hot, was now clammy with sweat. She laid a hand on his forehead. The fire was gone. He was slick with moisture, exhausted, but he was alive. She had won. She had faced the fever again, the great faceless thief, and this time she had won. There was no joy in it, only a profound, bone-deep weariness and the bitter knowledge that she had only postponed the inevitable. The world that had sent Silas would not forget about its lost quarry. He slept for a whole day. Laurette watched him, the rifle never far from her hand. She watched the way his eyelashes, clean now, lay dark against his pale cheeks. She watched the slow, steady rise and fall of his chest. He looked like a boy now. Stripped of the fever and the filth, he was just a child, thin, scarred, but a child. The sight of it was more painful than his wildness had been. The wildness was a shield. This fragile piece was a raw nerve. When he finally woke, his eyes were clear. He looked around the room, at the stone hearth, the rough-hewn table, the single window with its view of the dead, gray fields. Then he looked at her. The feral terror was gone. In its place was a vast, deep, and unnervingly intelligent watchfulness. He didn't speak. He just watched. Lorette pushed a bowl of thick stew toward him, real food, with chunks of potato and rabbit. He ate it slowly, deliberately, his eyes never leaving her face. When he was done, he pushed the bowl back toward her. It was the first gesture he had made that was not driven by instinct or fear. It was a communication, an acknowledgement. She took the bowl and stood up. As she turned, her foot bumped a small wooden crate by the hearth. The lid slid off, revealing its contents: a handful of whittled animals, a smoothed river stone, a bird's feather. Jonas's treasures. The boy's eyes fixed on the crate. He pushed himself up on one elbow, his gaze locked on a small, crudely carved wooden horse. It was the last thing Samuel had made for his younger brother before the fever took him. Lorette froze, watching him. He reached out a trembling hand, his fingers hovering over the horse. He didn't touch it. He just looked at it, and for the first time, his face softened. The guarded, watchful expression dissolved, replaced by something she hadn't seen in him, or in herself, for years. A flicker of simple, childish longing. She nudged the crate closer with her foot. An offering. He picked up the horse. His thumb stroked the worn, polished wood. He held it as if it were a living thing, a fragile bird. He didn't look at her. He just stared at the toy, his world shrinking to that single point of connection. That night, she didn't bolt him in the pantry. She let him sleep on the rug by the hearth. She sat in her chair, the rifle across her lap, and watched him. In his sleep, his hand was curled tightly around the little wooden horse. The days that followed fell into a new, fragile rhythm. He was still silent, but it was a different kind of silence. It was not the silence of a wild animal, but the silence of a person who has forgotten how to speak, or has chosen not to. He followed her as she did her chores, a small, quiet shadow. He watched her milk the cow, his eyes wide with a kind of focused curiosity. He watched her knead bread, his head cocked to one side. She started leaving small tasks for him: a bucket to be filled at the pump, a stack of wood to be carried to the hearth. He did them without question, his movements efficient and quick. He was strong, she realized, wiry and tough, like a sapling that has grown in a hard wind. One afternoon, as she was mending a fence at the edge of the property, he found a length of discarded wire. He sat on the ground, his back to a post, and began to twist it. Lorette watched him out of the corner of her eye. His fingers were nimble, sure. He worked for an hour, his brow furrowed in concentration. When he was done, he held it up. It was a bird, a creature of wire, with delicate wings and a sharp, inquisitive head. It was crude, but it was unmistakably alive. He held it out to her. His eyes were not questioning, not asking for praise. They were simply stating a fact. "I made this." Lorette took it. The wire was cool against her palm. She looked from the wire bird to the boy's face. His eyes were dark and serious, and in their depths, she saw it. Not language, not hope, but the faint, stubborn glimmer of a person who had been buried under layers of pain and fear, but who was still there, twisting wire into the shape of a bird. She closed her hand around it and slipped it into her apron pocket. She didn't smile. She didn't speak. She just turned back to her fence, but the hammer felt heavier in her hand. The world felt bigger. The silence in her house was no longer her own. A week later, the wagon came. It was Silas Croft. He wasn't with his pack of dogs and men this time. He was alone, driving a buckboard that rattled up her lane and stopped 20 yards from the porch. The boy was in the barn, forking hay. He had frozen at the sound of the wagon, his body instantly rigid, and then he had slipped into the deepest, darkest corner of the hayloft, vanishing like smoke. Lorette came out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. She didn't pick up the rifle. That was for dogs in the field. This was different. This was a parley. Silas Croft was a man in his 40s, with a weathered face and pale, cold eyes. He looked like 100 other hardscrabble farmers in the Gritstone, but there was a stillness to him, a predatory confidence that set him apart. He didn't get down from the wagon. "Afternoon, Key," he said, his voice flat. "Croft," she replied, her tone just as level. "Lost something out this way a couple of weeks back," he said, letting his eyes roam over her house, her barn, the fallow fields. "Vermin, been spoiling my stock, thought it might have run to ground on your property." "The only vermin I've seen lately," Lorette said, her voice like stones grinding together, "were running on 2 legs and holding leashes." A flicker of something, annoyance, maybe even respect, crossed his face. "It's a tender boy. Belonged to the river folk before we acquired him. Ran off from the quarry. He's property." Lorette's hands clenched into fists inside her apron pockets. One hand closed around the cool shape of the wire bird. River folk. Tenders. That's what Emmett had called them. The ones who lived by the seasonal creeks, who had no fences, who sang to the soil. Emmett had thought them fools, shiftless and pagan. He'd mocked their songs, humming parodies of their strange, winding melodies as he hammered fence posts into the unyielding earth. "Claiming what's yours, Lorette," he'd say. "That's what separates a man from a beast." "I haven't seen any boy," Lorette said. The lie was solid in her mouth. Silas Croft stared at her for a long time. His pale eyes were like chips of ice. He knew she was lying. She knew he knew. It was a game of wills, played across a dusty stretch of land. "That boy is more trouble than he's worth," Croft said finally, his voice taking on a conversational, almost friendly tone that was more menacing than his threats. "He don't speak right. He don't think right. They fill their heads with songs and dirt and forget their place. He's got a wicked streak, a biter. It's better for everyone if he's put down." "Then you should have shot him in your own field," Lorette said, "instead of chasing him onto mine." Croft almost smiled. It was a grim, tight-lipped thing. A woman alone, 2 sons gone, a hard thing. He said it not with sympathy, but as a statement of fact, a statement of her weakness. The world's a hard place, no room for strays. He clucked to his horse, the wagon groaning as it turned. "If you happen to see that vermin," he called over his shoulder, "you know who it belongs to." He rattled away, leaving a cloud of dust that settled slowly over the yard. Lorette stood on the porch until he was gone, until the dust had settled, until the only sound was the wind. The threat was no longer a phantom. It had a name and a face. It had called her son's deaths a hard thing. It had called the boy it. She went to the barn. She didn't call his name. He didn't have one she knew. She just stood in the doorway, letting her eyes adjust to the gloom. After a moment, a rustle from the hayloft. He peered down, his face a pale oval in the darkness. She held up the wire bird. "Silas Croft," she said, her voice clear and hard. "He is looking for you." The boy flinched at the name. He scrambled down the ladder, landing silently on the packed earth floor. He stood before her, breathing quickly, his eyes wide with a terror she hadn't seen since the first night. He was the wild thing again. She looked at him, at the thrumming fear that radiated from his small body. And she understood. This was not about defiance anymore. It was not about her grief or her anger at the world. It was about this child whose people sang songs her husband had mocked, this child who twisted wire into birds, this child who the world had named it and sentenced to death. That evening, a storm rolled in, Rain lashed against the windows, and the wind howled around the corners of the house. The sound was immense, a physical presence. Inside, by the fire, Lorette was cleaning the Winchester. The boy sat on the rug, watching the flames, the wooden horse in his lap. The storm's fury seemed to loosen something in the air between them. In the roar of the wind, the silence felt less heavy. Lorette looked at the boy. "What is your name?" she asked, her voice quiet, almost lost in the storm. He didn't look at her, but his hands stilled on the toy horse. He was listening. She tried again, her voice softer. "The Tenders, the river folk. What do they call you?" He shook his head, a small, tight gesture. A shudder went through him. Lorette set aside the rifle and the cleaning cloth. She sat on the floor, a few feet from him, her back against the hearth's warm stones. She did something she hadn't done in years. She thought of a song. Not one of Emmett's boisterous, earthy hymns, but one her own grandmother had sung to her, a simple lullaby about a river stone and the moon. She began to hum. It was a shaky, out-of-practice sound, a ghost of a melody. The boy went rigid. His head snapped up, and he stared at her, his eyes wide. The melody was simple, not one of his people's, but it was music. It was a shape made of sound in the roaring dark. He watched her, his lips parted slightly. And then, so quietly, she almost missed it in the howl of the wind, he hummed a single note in return. It was not her melody. It was a different key, a different feeling. It was a note of deep, resonant sorrow. Lorette stopped humming. She just listened. He hummed another note, and another. A phrase began to form. It was a strange, winding melody, like a creek finding its way through rocks. It rose and fell, full of unexpected turns. It was one of the songs Emmett had laughed at. Listen to that caterwauling, Lorette, like a cat in a bucket. But listening to it now, in the storm-lashed house, with the boy who had survived the whip and the fever, it wasn't caterwauling. It was beautiful. It sounded like the wind. It sounded like growing things. It sounded like roots digging deep into dark earth. He hummed the melody through once, his eyes fixed on the fire. When he was done, he fell silent. He looked at her, and his eyes were clear. "Kaylin," he whispered. The name was a rough, cracked thing, as if his vocal cords had forgotten their purpose. Lorette's breath caught in her throat. "Kaylin. Kaylin," she repeated, tasting the name. It felt ancient and strong. He nodded. Then he looked down at the wooden horse in his hands. He pointed a thin finger at it. "Sona," he said. "Horse." Lorette pointed to the fire. "Fire," she said. He watched her lips. Ray, he repeated, the sound clumsy. She pointed to the rain streaming down the window pane. "Rain." "Avo," he said, his voice a little stronger. "Rain." And so it began. A trade. A word for a word. A bridge built of sounds, arching over the chasm of their silence. Fire and water and lin, bread and tesh. The world began to fill with names, his and hers, weaving together in the small, lamplit room. He learned quickly. His mind was a dry sponge, soaking up every word. And as the words came, so did the memories. They came in flashes, shards of a life before Silas Croft. He spoke of a woman with hair like his, her hands smelling of river clay. Era, my mother. He spoke of a man who taught him the songs of the seeds. Ron, my father. He described a life lived in motion, following the water, sleeping under stars, a life so alien to Lorette's world of fences and deeds that it might as well have been on another planet. He told her, in his halting, pieced-together speech, how Croft and his men had come. Not like hunters, but like slavers. They had rounded up his people, those they didn't kill, to work their quarry, digging for flint and granite. They had been starved, beaten, worked until they collapsed. Kaylin had run. He had been running for weeks, living on grubs and stolen roots, before the final desperate chase that had brought him to her field. As he spoke, Lorette felt the last remnants of her grief-frozen detachment begin to crack. The granite stone in her gut was breaking apart. He was not an abstract symbol of injustice. He was Kalen, son of Era and Roan. He was the keeper of songs she had allowed her husband to mock. Her silence, she realized, had been a form of complicity. Her grief had made her a bystander to a world she should have been fighting. Protecting him was no longer about defying Silas Croft. It was about honoring the memory of Era and Roan. It was an apology to the songs she had never bothered to understand. It was, she admitted to herself in the deepest, quietest part of the night, a penance for the two sons she could not save. This one, she could. This one, she would. They had a month of this fragile peace, a month of words and chores and shared quiet meals. Kalen grew stronger. The haunted look in his eyes began to recede, replaced by a quick, sharp intelligence. He showed her how to find edible mushrooms in the woods, how to read the clouds for weather. He taught her the names of the stars in his own tongue. The house was no longer silent. It was filled with the low murmur of their two languages, a conversation that was slowly becoming one. Lorette taught him how to shoot the rifle. He was a natural. His hands were steady, his eye sharp. He held the weapon not with aggression, but with a kind of solemn respect. He understood it was a tool, like a shovel or an axe, a tool for survival. She knew Croft would be back. It was inevitable. He was not a man to let a challenge go unanswered. His pride was a blade that needed to be kept sharp. They prepared. They didn't speak of it directly, but every action was bent toward it. They reinforced the door, boarded up the back window. They stockpiled water and food in the cellar. They created a plan, a silent, understood strategy. He would return at dusk. He was a creature of the twilight. And one evening, as the sun bled out behind the western ridge, they heard it. Not a wagon this time. The soft thud of horses' hooves on the lane. More than one. Kalen, who was splitting kindling by the woodpile, went still. He looked at Lorette, who was standing on the porch. Their eyes met. There was no fear in his gaze now. There was a grim, hard resolve that mirrored her own. "Go," she said. He didn't run to the barn. He slipped into the house, grabbing the smaller rifle, the one she had taught him to use, and went to the attic window that overlooked the lane. His post. Lorette picked up the Winchester. It felt like an extension of her arm. She stood on the porch, waiting. 3 riders emerged from the trees. Silas Croft in the center, flanked by 2 hard-faced men she recognized from the hunt. They did not stop at a polite distance. They rode right up to her garden, their horses trampling the last of her withered tomato plants. "Lorette," Croft said. It was not a greeting. It was a summons. "I've come for my property." "He is not your property," Lorette said, her voice carrying in the still air. "He is a thing," Croft snarled, his patience gone. "A piece of livestock, and you are a thief. I gave you a chance to be sensible. Now I'm done with chances." He swung down from his horse. The other 2 men dismounted, fanning out, their hands on their own rifles. "Get out of my house, woman, and give me the boy. Do that, and you can live out your miserable days in this sad little box. Don't, and we'll burn it to the ground with you in it." Lorette felt a strange calm settle over her. The world had shrunk to this porch, these men, and the boy in the attic window. The choice was so simple, it was no choice at all. Live alone in her silence, or die protecting the only thing that had given that silence meaning. Her husband had built fences to keep the world out. She would burn those fences down to save one small piece of it. "His name," she said, her voice ringing with a clarity that surprised her, "is Kalen." Croft's face tightened into a mask of rage. "I don't care what you call it." He took a step toward the porch. "Last chance." "No," Lorette said. It was the simplest, most powerful word she had ever spoken. Croft nodded to one of his men. "Jeb, the barn first." The man named Jeb started toward the barn, a lit torch in his hand. He was going to smoke them out. Before he had taken 3 steps, a rifle cracked, not hers. The shot came from above, from the attic. A puff of dust kicked up at Jeb's feet. A warning shot. Kaylin's warning shot. Jeb jumped back, cursing. Croft and the other man raised their rifles, firing at the house. Wood splintered from the porch posts. A window shattered. Lorette dropped to one knee, bringing the Winchester to her shoulder. She did not aim for Croft. She aimed for his horse. An animal for an animal. She fired. The horse screamed, a terrible high-pitched sound, and collapsed, its legs folding beneath it. Croft roared in fury, scrambling away from the falling animal. He fired blindly at the porch. Lorette felt a searing pain in her left arm, as if a hot poker had been laid against her flesh. She ignored it. She levered another round into the chamber. The fight dissolved into chaos. Gunshots echoed in the twilight. Kaylin, from his high vantage point, was a ghost. He fired sparingly, precisely, pinning the men down, forcing them to take cover behind their horses. Lorette used the porch pillars for cover, firing whenever one of the men exposed himself. The man Jeb made a run for the side of the house, trying to get a new angle. Lorette saw him. She tracked him, fired. He cried out and fell, clutching his leg. He was out of the fight. Now, it was 2 against 2. Croft and the other man were crouched behind the remaining horse. "You're dead, Kay!" Croft screamed, his voice hoarse with rage. "You and that little savage are dead!" Lorette didn't answer. She was reloading. Her arm was on fire, blood soaking her sleeve, but her hands were steady. The world was blood and smoke and the smell of gunpowder. She felt strangely alive. The silence had been a slow death. This violence was a final, terrible birth. She saw Croft motioning to his last man. They were going to rush her. From the corner of her eye, she saw a flicker of movement. The back door. Kaylin. He had left his post. He was a streak of motion, low to the ground, circling around behind the men, using the woodpile and the old watering trough for cover. He was holding the small rifle in one hand and a hatchet in the other. He was no longer just the hunted. He was a hunter, too. Croft and his man rose, firing, charging the porch. Lorette fired back, taking cover. A bullet ripped through the wall next to her head, showering her with splinters. She fired again. Croft's man stumbled, but kept coming. Then, a cry from behind them. Kaylin erupted from the shadows. He moved with the impossible speed she had seen that first night, but this was not panic. It was purpose. He swung the hatchet, a blur of motion, catching Croft's man in the back of the knee. The man screamed and went down. Croft spun around, his eyes wide with shock at this sudden attack from the rear. He raised his rifle to shoot Kaylin. "No!" Lorette screamed, her voice tearing from her throat. She stood up from behind the pillar, fully exposed, and fired the Winchester from her hip. The shot took Croft square in the chest. The force of it threw him backward. He landed on the dusty ground with a heavy, final thud. His rifle clattered beside him. Silence. The only sound was the whimpering of the man named Jeb and the harsh, ragged breathing of Kaylin. Lorette stood on the porch, the Winchester smoking in her hands. Her arm was a blaze of agony. Blood dripped from her fingertips onto the wooden boards. She looked at Croft's still form. She looked at Kaylin, who was standing over the other man, the bloody hatchet in his hand, his chest heaving. He looked at her. His eyes were wide, ancient. They were the eyes of a boy who had been forced to kill to live. She had won. They had survived. And then she heard it. A faint whistle. A sound she had heard once before. From the sorghum field. A 4th man. There had been a 4th man, left with the dogs. Before she could shout a warning, a rifle cracked from the field. Kaylin didn't flinch. He was looking at her. But she did. A sudden, sharp, immense pressure in her chest. The world tilted. The Winchester felt impossibly heavy. It slipped from her grasp. She looked down. A dark stain was spreading across the front of her dress. She fell to her knees. The pain was distant, replaced by a strange, encroaching cold. "Lorette!" Kalen screamed the name. He ran to her, dropping the hatchet. He slid to his knees beside her on the porch. She looked at his face. The face of the wild boy. The face of the son she had chosen. The terror was back in his eyes, but it was for her. She reached up a trembling hand, her good hand, and touched his cheek. Her fingers came away smeared with his tears and her own blood. "Run!" she whispered, the word a bubble of air and blood in her throat. He shook his head frantically, holding her, trying to stop the bleeding that would not be stopped. "No, not without you." "Your song," she coughed, a spray of red misting the air. "Sing. Your song." She needed to hear it one last time. The song of the earth, the song of roots and return. He understood. His face crumpled in grief, but he began to sing. His voice was shaky, broken, but the melody was there. The winding, ancient tune of his people. It filled the twilight. It was a song of the river, of the deep soil, of things that die and are born again from the ground. Lorette listened. The pain was fading. The cold was spreading. She looked past Kalen's shoulder at the field where the last man was, at the house her husband had built, at the 2 small, unmarked graves on the hill where she had buried her sons. She had failed to protect them from the quiet thief of fever, but she had protected this one from the loud, brutal violence of men. Her silence was finally, irrevocably broken, and in its place was a song. Her eyes met Kalen's. She tried to smile. It was a small, bloody effort. The choice had been made. She would not live alone. She had died protecting the one child who had never asked to be saved, but who had, in the end, saved her from the silence. Her last breath was a sigh, a release, and it vanished into the notes of his unending, sorrowful, beautiful song. The world kept turning, the sun went down, but here, on this small patch of blood-soaked land, an immeasurable price had been paid, and a terrible maternal grief had found its final, ravaged peace.